My name is Brooke Muller. I'm the interim dean of the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our University of Oregon's home here in Portland, the White Stag Building in Old Town. For 8 years, we have met together to honor one of the state's outstanding historic preservation professionals, and today we celebrate the accomplishments of Sally Donovan of Hood River, Oregon. Congratulations, Sally.
Sally Donovan is being honored with the 2016 McMath Award today, and she joins a number of dedicated preservation professionals who have been so honored. Thank you, Sally, for being here and for inspiring such a wonderful turnout of friends and family. Sally Donovan has led Donovan Associates, a historic preservation firm in Hood River, Oregon, since a year after her graduation from the University of Oregon's Historic Preservation Program in 1987. Her list of National Register nominations, building surveys, preservation plans for counties and cities, large format photography of historic properties, master plans for historic districts, environmental impact statements, and more, runs well into the hundreds. Her firm, a certified women-owned business, specializes in preservation and treatment of historic cemeteries. Donovan and her husband, Bruce Howard, have now been working together for about 15 years, repairing gravestones and conducting workshops at several sites throughout Oregon. She and Howard teach appropriate techniques for resetting tilted, leaning, and falling markers, and for documenting dislocated grave markers and marker fragments. In yet another capacity, Sally served as an adjunct instructor in the University of Oregon's Historic Preservation Program over a period of 10 years. Her photographs, particularly the large format black and white photographs for Habs and Hare documentation, for example, are suitably objective but go beyond to an artistic quality that is a result of her well-practiced work in the darkroom, something that she started when she was a student at the University of Oregon, working under Philip Dole, as I recall. In summary, Sally's professional and friendly demeanor has brought many to the fold of historic preservation, from the personal mentoring of volunteers and classes taught at the University of Oregon to advocacy and public policy applied at the local level. Much of the important work that takes place by many of you here in our nation to safeguard and commemorate our shared heritage goes unacknowledged by the general public. We, therefore, need to be thankful to those like Sally Donovan, who tirelessly and competently perform the work of our heritage conservation. Please welcome Sally Donovan, this year's award recipient.
I think I grew up in, a subdivision in Omaha, Nebraska, and my mother, I think, was an influence because she always loved antiques, and so she was always taking us to antique stores and historic cemeteries. So we went out and cleaned our family's graves and went out and did that. So that's kind of my early life. My dad loved to build things, so he was always figuring things out, building. And my older brother became an architect, so that kind of influenced me. He was 5 years older, so I was one of the first women to take architecture in our high school. They weren't allowing women in at that time, and mechanical drawing. So I kind of started with that. I really didn't get interested in preservation until after I graduated. Graduated from the University of Nebraska and got a job with the archaeologists doing cartography work out in the field. And I was doing the mapping for them. So they go out and map these historic sites and archaeological sites. And then I would go and do all the mapping and graphics for them. During the summers, they were slow, so I'd go out in the field with them. And we'd live in tents for the summer. And then they sent me out to the historic sites along the Niobrara River in western Nebraska. And I did the photographing for them. And that's how I fell in love with these buildings that were out there just in the middle of nowhere, especially in this isolated, like Eastern Oregon, it's kind of like that. But beautiful farmsteads that were vacant, and we got to measure them and take photos and just spend our time doing that. So that's when I really started thinking about a career in preservation, is after I worked with them for 3 years. And there wasn't at that point, there wasn't a lot of programs available in historic preservation. They had them in like folklore, history, things like that, but not really in preservation. So there was only 3 schools that I was really looking at that point. And then the University of Oregon just had started theirs in 1980. And so this was in 1984 when I started graduate school. People were in folklore more, or historians. They weren't in the technical side, or they very much were in the more technical side of restoration work, hands-on building restoration, things like that. So really there's only about 3 of us when I graduated in '87 that went through the program. And it took me, it's a 2-year program. I worked out for 3 years and worked on different jobs during that time. Supported myself by doing technical illustration for different departments. Some of the professors that were influential to me at the University of Oregon were Philip Dole, and so he started the program in 1980 with a couple other people, and it was really the first one on the West Coast that went into historic preservation. So they really started as an interdisciplinary program. They wanted you to take all different kinds of classes, from learning about history of architecture to planning, geography, archaeology, hands-on preservation work. And then Mike Schellenbarger at the university, he was actually taught a class in masonry preservation, and I think that's when I really started looking at historic buildings. We had to document a building and look at every single brick almost on this building and draw it. And so I really credit him with that love of learning about masonry and what that was and how it worked, and that really helped me in my cemetery restoration work too. And then the third person I remember is Robert Melnick, and he's a landscape preservationist. And at that point, that was really new. It wasn't really something you talked about, and you looked at preservation not as a building, but as a whole area, like a cemetery or a park. And so we took a class in that, and I learned tremendous amounts from him. And that's when I started really looking at historic cemeteries, studying them, and going back east and doing work on the history of the rural cemetery movement in the United States and how that affected our current planning and cemetery movement. At that point during early career, just when I graduated, there were some opportunities for students. During school, I worked for the planning department in Eugene, and we did survey work. And that was really what the basis of preservation was at that time. They had a goal 5, which was land use planning goal that mandated that the governments inventory their historic resources. So that's where we got our work. That's kind of where the kind of building blocks of Oregon's preservation movement started. So that's what we did a lot of. So we got a lot of historic context statements. We're writing the history of the town or the community, and then we do survey work, and that's what kept us going. So that's kind of where I thought I would go, and it's a really good way. I always tell students, a great way to start, because you really look at the buildings, and it's a good way to learn about styles and building techniques and everything. So it's really a foundation, so I'm glad I got that. And it was a matter of need. I wanted to start my own business, and you just took on jobs because you've heard about an RFP, a request for a proposal, and you went after it. And so it just kind of developed. I still don't a lot market my things. It just kind of happens, like my cemetery preservation work. It just kind of happened along the way. And I think around 1991, there was a contract that came out to document all the Oregon Coast lighthouses. And I got the contract, and it was like, oh shoot, what do I do now? I was pretty new in preservation. So what the contract was to do a survey of all the lighthouses, and then also do it's called a multiple property nomination of the lighthouses, so we could put the ones that weren't on the National Register on the National Register. So that's how the project kind of started, and that was like a 2-year project with lighthouses, and we got to go to all of them except Tillamook Rock. We did large format photography of the the lighthouses, and also we document them historically and architecturally, and that goes to the Library of Congress. So it's a way to document them for, you know, for a long time, and do the detail work that if these resources disappear, they'll have drawings, architectural drawings and engineering drawings. We worked on Cape Ergo Lighthouse, I don't know, 5 years ago or so. And that one actually is, the land is slumping away, and so it's gradually getting really close to the edge. Coast Guard still owned the property, but they wanted to give the property away, and now the tribes have it. I just heard about that actually a couple weeks ago. But there's a land bridge that connected the lighthouse to the land, and they actually took that down. So you can't get out there now other than low tide. So what we did, we went in and we did architectural drawing or engineering drawings of that. We used past original drawings, we updated them, and then we also did the large format photography and the history of the building. So we just did the Heceta Head Lighthouse. We did the survey and inventory of it, and the University of Oregon did student projects there on the house, a resident duplex. Lots of ghost stories. And that's kind of unusual because there's not a lot of houses associated with the lighthouses anymore. Over time, there's just been lots of incidences, I guess, there. So that kind of led to other projects down the road in terms of doing Historic American Building Survey, which is HAB's work, and that's large format photography work. And HAIR is the other component, which is historic engineering recordation. Those are stored at the Library of Congress, so they're online. You can see the photographs and the documentation. Sometimes they go to the Historical Society in Portland, or the local repositories like Hood River Museum here, so it just depends. So the HAB's documentation has been going on since the 30s and 40s. And you know, the technology has changed so much. So back then, using 4x5 view cameras was a way to do it. So it's becoming more of a specialty thing. I don't get a lot of work doing that. I do it maybe twice a year. The State Historic Preservation Office, which is SHPO for short, they don't require that as often as they used to because of the quality of digital now, photography. So, but it's, you know, it's a whole different way of working. It's, you know, half an hour to an hour a shot, and you're just, you know, it's just a whole different process, you know. So it's been fun. I've worked outside of Oregon and Idaho, a little bit in Alaska and California, and Washington, especially cemetery work. We do workshops in cemetery preservation pretty much in other states. So the 1988 is when I graduated from the University of Oregon, 88 or 87. And so one of the first jobs was to survey the downtown Hood River. The city hired our consulting team to do the historic survey, and we had Sharper Haska, and then George McMath was the other one that we hired, and he's one of the premier preservation architects at that time, so we felt very fortunate to have him on our team. And they had, I think, 42 buildings that we surveyed. So we did architectural description and history. And there's a lot of history already done on the building. So I worked with Ruth Guppy, who was a historian here that did lots of work at the museum here. I feel very fortunate because her parents settled here in the 1880s or 90s, I guess. And so they had that, at that point, you had that direct link to the beginning of Hood River, which was wonderful. But downtown, like the Hood River Hotel, which is on First and Oak, was basically a boarded up building. The upstairs was all condemned. There wasn't a lot of activity. They had moved a lot of the cannery buildings and those services to Odell. So that changed the whole flavor of Hood River, because Hood River it was pretty dead at that point. A lot of not boarded up buildings, but underutilized buildings. And the windsurfers were just starting to come into the area, you know, a few years prior to that. So things were changing, and there was the interest in it. So one of the first people that I met was Pasquale and Jackie Barone, who came down from Canada, and they took the Hood River Hotel on as a project. And I was hired to do the National Register nomination for them. This was after the survey. I think this was in 90, 91, somewhere around there. And that really, their energy and their commitment to that building really started this domino effect. That part of downtown was completely dead. I mean, at that point, maybe Third and Oak was kind of active. You know, you had the stationery store there, you had some banks and things. The US Bank was still in the Butler Bank building on Third and Oak. So things were changing, and they really were, I think, what started it. I think just getting people thinking about buying the buildings, because they put a lot of money into it, and people started thinking, oh, well, you know, if they're going to do it, let's look to see what happens with them. And they put their heart and soul into that building, and that what you saw happen in a year or two after that was done is that the adjacent property owners just started building or started rehabbing their buildings. And Gary Bushman was another one that had a building across the street, and he started rehabbing those buildings. So that really started that. And then we really worked hard. We got a landmarks board organized. We got a historic ordinance. And I think in 1994, we did a local historic district in downtown Hood River, which heightened the awareness about the buildings, good and bad. There was, that was the hardest historic district I've ever worked on, getting it through. A lot of people at that time, a lot of the real estate agents thought it would be detrimental and the property values would go down. And so they didn't want the district, and they made it quite clear at the public hearings. Now, those same real estate agents, I've got to give them credit now, call the city all the time, get the inventory forms, and are like knowing the value of historic, you know, buildings and the downtown. So, but it was a hard district. It was almost a tie vote, and we just eked it through. And then we started working with the Landmarks Board. We had Bill Pattison, he's the local, worked at Scott's Insurance for years, and just a local historian, grew up here, and he was instrumental too in the Landmarks Board. Art Larson, an architect, Mickey Chapman was early. Instead of making Landmarks Board kind of something scary and regulatory, we made an effort to get out in the community and use our different expertise to help people. So we had we developed this hour of consulting time for free. We just go out and talk about paint colors or windows or whatever it was, and tried to work with the property owners. And most of the time that really worked, that getting out in the community and doing that. So that was, and we tried to offer worked with some of the hardware stores, and they'd offer like 10% off paint if you were going to paint your building downtown. So I think that worked. You know, I think it went from a regulatory agency to somebody that might help. I mean, we had some difficult, you know, problems that came up and stuff, but I think generally, and Cindy Walbridge at the city has been there since '91, I think, and she's been amazing, just, you know, showing us how to get through the process of all these different things we did. From design guidelines, which we developed design guidelines for the residential areas, to the planning part, to putting plaques on the buildings. She just, every year, we'd write the grants and then just do the projects like that. So she was amazing. Well, downtown Hood River, when we first started, it was underutilized. I mean, I think that's what we learn as preservationists, is that it's a key part, development, and you have to work within that framework, and that's the hard part sometimes, because you have new buildings, people want to change the old buildings that aren't quite compatible, and so that's where the rub is. We had a few issues like that in downtown, but I would say, you know, Hood River's used as an example now as preservation kind of in action. It's worked. One thing we saw, I think maybe it was the late 90s, is that big corporation would come in and demolish, because it was so active, demolish 4 or 5 buildings downtown. And we don't have that many buildings downtown. So that was really interesting, you know, to think about how, you know, communities are preserved when there's no money in terms of being intact. Okay, when you start getting money infused in a community, you sometimes have the issues of overdevelopment, tearing down. I mean, that's happening now all over Hood River, and not doing appropriate kind of restoration work or rehabilitation work on a building. So it's a balance all the time like that. I think Hood River's done a really good job at that. There's some buildings that aren't. We had new buildings in downtown, and that was controversial. One of the newest buildings was where Dopio's is now. It's on 3rd and Oak Street on the north side of the street, and it was an infill building. It was a parking lot, and so that was one of our biggest kind of challenges, I think, because it was higher than the other buildings. We wanted to keep the scale appropriate for the downtown. So there was a lot of working with the Landmarks Board on how to have that fit in. So the architects, they work with the architects on it, and residential use on the upper stories was new, although there's a lot of residential that can be put in downtown right now, and it's a matter of building code issues. So they're underutilized. You know, they're used as office space, but a lot of people would like to make them into living spaces, and that's not happening because it costs a lot of money to rehab those buildings into a second floor use, you know, in terms of structural or whatever. That was something else we dealt with as living downtown. And parking, you know, they were going to build a parking structure in downtown. I don't know how many times that's come up, you know, especially when they started demolishing the cannery buildings, because they, in the early 90s and late 80s, they demolished some really big cannery buildings downtown and left a huge hole. So we have the buildings on, with a Cascade between 4th and 5th, or 6th, there's that apartment complex, the townhomes. And that was another one that went in front of the Landmarks Board. And some people didn't like that. But you know, the thing that it does, it creates that vitality downtown that you need to support that restoration of the buildings, you know, and that sense of place. So there's a development that's been in the works. It's the Union Building. Pasquale and Jackie Barone owned that building forever. And so it used to be a cold storage building, and really integral part of the whole downtown, because they, you know, that's where they stored the fruit, and you know, the railroad tracks are right there. Pasquale particularly, that was kind of his dream building to get that back going, and he's been doing that. It's a little bit, it's not a restoration work, it's definitely a rehabilitation work, because structurally he had to do a lot of modifications to the building. But you know, I guess I've learned over 30 years of doing this, there's compromise in preservation, and to see that building used again rather than demolished is really, you know, it's really great to see that. You know, they're going to be like condominiums, so that's a different use, and sometimes when you change uses, the building doesn't quite look like it was before. So that's kind of what's happening there. But the great side is that that's going to become a vital part of downtown Hood River, you know, and people are going to live there. You know, he worked through being right next to the railroad tracks, you know, rehabbing the building. So it's a huge project, and I think that building would have probably been demolished. It was sitting vacant for so long. So, you know, it is a compromise in the way it doesn't look historic like it did, but he's also doing things on the inside. There's an old Pelton wheel inside there that used to have a water source for the canneries, and he's making a little museum out of that. So the story's going to be told, and there's a lot of documentation on the Union Building, because it was one of the first buildings. It was actually, part of it was 1905, I think, a really early building in Hood River. So I'm glad it's being used and rehabbed, you know. So the water source for that Pelton wheel started at a spring way up on the heights in Hood River, and they piped it all down and down to this building. So yeah, you can see it on there's Sanborn fire insurance maps, and you can see that piping all the way up to the height. So it's pretty cool. You know, those maps are really interesting to see. So in terms of what's happening in downtown Hood River, I think a lot of the buildings have been rehabbed already, and it's pretty stable. What we developed with the Landmarks Board over the years is we used to do a whole review when a project came in, like the new building downtown. It'd go through the whole landmarks, public hearing, all that. So what we did over the years is establish a kind of hierarchy. If you're going to do this, like put up a new awning, we used to take it through the whole Landmarks Board. Well, that's onerous for the property owner, so we don't want that. We want to make it an easier process. And we also had no fees associated with it for a while. My concern is the outer areas of residential, because they're tearing down small houses and building up, you know, fourplexes and things like that. So our neighborhoods, just like all over the United States, is happening. You have these infill housing that are really taking the guts out of our community. And when you're in a small community like Hood River, there's not a lot. So that worries me. We see on the Heights, there's infill development. You know, the Heights in Hood River used to be a separate community. They had their own bakery, they had their own drugstore, things like that. And it's becoming a vital portion of Hood River now. We've lost a lot of our services downtown. Like when I first moved here, there was the Cure drugstore, there was Fran's Hardware, you know, barber shops, things like that. The services were downtown, and that's something that when tourism communities, those start disappearing for gift stores and things like that. So that's just a transition that happens, and you know, it was a little bit sad, especially when Fran's Hardware closed. That was really hard to see. I think the residential is where the worrisome part is, because you have a finite number of historic buildings. It's not like you can replace those. So even this, and the Heights, I think, is more at risk because the houses are little and they're on tiny lots. I mean, our house is tiny and we have a bigger lot. You could build a duplex or fourplex on it. You know, I'm not opposed to taking a house that shouldn't be saved and building, but what, you know, when we see these houses that are, you know, in historic areas that are so huge, they're just big, they don't fit in, they're, you know, the scale's wrong. We tried to do that in our design guidelines, but they're just guidelines, they're not standards. So, you know, it's hard to see that, you know, because they're going to be there for a long time. But there's really good examples up on the Heights too of infill housing that fit in, and it's just, it looks like the streetscape, historic streetscape. There's standards instead of guidelines that developers would follow. It would help a little bit with historic areas. And we're not talking about all areas of Hood River. You know, and there's different kinds of lots. You know, the 1950s subdivisions are different feeling than the downtown buildings because they're closer together, the residences in downtown. So it's all dependent on where you are and what the design is like that. So we took some of our guidelines, residential guidelines, and Cindy did able to take it through the Planning Commission. We made standards out of them, basically for lot coverage and setbacks and height of buildings. So we did do that, so that helped a little bit. But they weren't quite ready to go to the full, you know, taking all the guidelines and making them into standards. Yeah. There's a house in the Dalles that we went by numerous times on 3rd Street, I think. And it had a little thing in the window, house for sale. And you see it in the paper every week, house for $1 if you move it. So our friends who are archaeologists in the Dalles kept saying, you guys should take this project on. You should, you know, I was like, oh yeah, right, we need to do that, you know, because, you know, we're doing all this other work. But it kept coming back at us. It just kept coming back and coming back. And so we had started working on a rehab house right by our house on Taylor Street in Hood River, rehabbing that house, and it was a big project. And concurrently, we got some other partners together and we decided to buy this house. So, and this house had not been touched. We did a walkthrough of it, and the inside was just like it was back in the 20s or teens. And there was 3 bachelors that lived there that were brothers. And so it passed down through the family. So anyway, the insides just had this great feeling about it. But it was bad. My brother called it the Addams Family house. So anyway, we finally got the house negotiated. We went in to sign the papers, and my godchild was with us, and she offered him $10 for the house. We ended up paying $10 for the house instead of $1. And then, and proceeded with 2 partners to move this house, which we had never done. So it was like a really good thing for a preservationist to do, to take on something that you talk to clients about. You actually do the work. So we figured out everything from moving the, you know, telephone lines to the electrical, how much that would cost. We hired a moving firm from Portland that does Emirate movers, and they do a lot of the big houses. But it was fascinating to learn about. They use jet airplane wheels because they're so compact and they can hold that, you know, weight. And then they use hydraulics to lift this house up on, and it had to come off of the site over a retaining wall and down onto the street. So it's fascinating to watch. And what we actually did, we found out we'd save, I think, almost $20,000 if we cut off 6 feet of the roof to get it under the major power line. So Bruce, my brother-in-law, and my nephew cut off the roof, got up there, took down the chimney, cut off the roof, and we were able to pass it through most of the power lines without, it cost us $5,000 instead of, a lot more money. And then we were able to reconstruct the roof and put it back on. We had a great building. The building official in the Dalles was really great about just letting us put it back, He goes, this house has been there for 150 years, put it back on. But we moved it on a Sunday morning, like at 5 o'clock in the morning they started, and I think by 10 o'clock, it was on the new site. So we were able to find a lot, and it was in a residential area right next to another Victorian house, so it fit into the neighborhood, and it had an existing garage on it. There was a house on it at one time, so we saved the garage. So put new foundation, rewiring, we painted every surface of that building, and tried to keep it as historic as we could, and we did a pretty good job. But it was really fun to see this house, and people loved that house. That's one thing we found. People stopped by all the time and said, oh, I knew the Steers brothers who used to live here, and I'm so glad. And the original owner's family came one time and went through the house, and they were just so happy that we were restoring it. We found all sorts of things in the walls that the kids had had an attic space. The second floor was a half story, and they had areas that you could kind of stuff things down in the side, and we found kids' toys and magazines, things like that, a hat that we thought was from the Civil War or something. We took off one of the trim boards on the outside of the bay window, and it had the builder's name on it. It was a French family, and he had signed his name 1889, and so we signed our name and put when we did it and put it back on. But those kinds of things were just really fun to see in the house. It was just like that preservation coming alive. The move was about $25,000, and then the utilities, probably spent another 10, and then we had to put foundation underneath, and new roof. So we spent a lot of money on the house, and the Dalles market isn't like Hood Rivers, so. There's more money in the Dalles historically, so they have more historic houses there, and it was bigger, and grander houses than Hood River did. As a kid, like I said, we always went out to clean the graves, and I was just fascinated by the carvings. I think from my art background, it was fun to see how the stones were decorated, and Mom would take me out to these, Mormon cemeteries in Nebraska, and so I just developed that love for cemeteries. And when I was an undergraduate, for one of my thesis, I photographed a cemetery. That's what I did. I was majoring in photography. And so I would pick these cemeteries and go out and photograph them. So I just loved the imagery, and that got me interested in that. But really in historic preservation, in 1989, I was working with the Office of Robert Perrin in Portland. They were a landscape architect firm. And they asked me to join them on a master plan for the Jacksonville Cemetery in Southern Oregon. And that's really when things just started for me. I did the history of the cemetery, and then we looked at everything from circulation patterns in the cemetery to, how it was laid out, maintenance, road systems. I like cemetery preservation because you really learn a lot about it, lots of different areas. You have to really look at signage, circulation. It's not just the headstone. I went back to the East Coast at first to do research on the development of the rural cemetery movement and just how that all happened. And I went to Harvard, and they had this great resource base there. And I just spent about 4 days just researching cemeteries and things. And then the state concurrently started their a cemetery commission, the state of Oregon. Yeah, they have one of the most progressive preservation programs for cemeteries in the United States. And so that really started this whole push with the state to get involved with pioneer cemeteries. So we started, I think, in 1997 or 8, doing a workshop in Willamina, Oregon. And we worked with community members on just going out to the cemetery and actually getting stones back up, And we weren't, at that point, we really weren't doing intricate kind of repairs. We were just putting them back up. It's pretty easy to do. But that started that process. Every year they'd hire us to do a workshop for the communities, and that got people in learning how to do that the proper way. And then over the years, the state developed this really great, if you go on their website, they have wonderful historic cemetery website that goes into everything from washing stones to rehabbing, what to do, what not to do. So I think we started working with communities all over the state and doing these workshops, and then we get jobs from these grants every year. We started Mosier, I don't know, 8 years ago, maybe. We did a workshop up there through the State Historic Preservation Office, and then they wanted to do a master plan, but they didn't have a lot of money, and they got a small grant from the state, and what my job was to go in and basically sit in on this group of community members who are interested in getting the pioneer of Mosier Cemetery active again as a burial grounds. But this group met every month, and they just hashed through all these issues. They were amazing to work with, so committed, and they all had this expertise that was, somebody knew about plants, somebody knew, a surveyor that could do that. So they used their local expertise to develop this plan. And there was a need there. A child had died, 2 children had died actually, and they wanted to have their cremains buried there. So it was a real personal thing to get the cemetery open again for cremating burials. So long story short, just maybe the last 4 months, it went through the state process, and now it's a legal burying ground. We actually we didn't want the historic burials to be impacted, so in the master plan we designed zones for new burials so it wouldn't impact the old ones. So the latest thing, they got some money to do a small sign up there. So if you've been up there, it's just wonderful. It's an amazing place up there. And there's only about 8 above ground stones, but it tells the history of Mosier, and it's just kind of a magical place. So somebody documented all the wildflowers up there, so it's just a wonderful place. The kids go up there every year to learn about different things. My work has changed over the last couple of years, and I'm doing cemetery work because I love the field work. I love being out in the field. And putting something back up and doing that, it's like moving that house, but smaller, it is magical. I worked on a little child's grave in Eugene, and it was broken into, I think, 9 pieces, and it was 1870. I would talk to her. I had a workshop in my house, and I would just, it's a really slow process building these stones back up and doing that work. And I just talked to her. It was Cora Bell, and I'd say, Cora Bell, we're going to do your top now. You're almost back together now. And then to see her go back out into the cemetery and be put up again was really wonderful. That kind of connection with that person that was at Pauper's Field, and this little girl had died at age 2. So that was that kind of, and I just like being outside and working with my hands like that too. So it is a spiritual place, and I think Bruce and I both get enjoyment out of that, seeing things get back up. And I think the fascinating part about cemeteries too, it's just multifaceted. You can learn about genealogy, you can learn about stone carving, the technology trends of the time, how it changed from marble stones to granite, and how it really does. If you look at the cemetery stone types and styles, and they really do mimic architectural styles, in terms of simplicity, like when the Art Deco came in, and and in the 50s, of course, when you had the lawn cemeteries, everything was, modern. But, and I love learning about the land, how it happened. And most of the cemeteries we work on are like IOOF, the International Order of Odd Fellows, the Masonic cemeteries, because they always had cemeteries in small towns, because that was part of what they were organized for, was to help the dead, help widows, and so they almost every single one has a section like that. And you learn about, at the time, the Catholics, they had a Catholic cemetery in Jacksonville, and that they were shunned basically, and they were in the back of the cemetery, and they had their own separate road. You learn about the culture at the time, and religious beliefs. So the things people planted, what they put on their stones was just amazing sometimes. You really do this double take. So what's happening now is that with historic cemeteries, since when they were first organized, they were out in a rural area, but that rural area has been encompassed by by the city now, and so they're used as public parks. We worked in the city of Salem, and it's actually owned by, the Pioneer Cemetery is owned by the city, and so they use it as a park. So part of our job is saying, what impact does that use as a park have on that cemetery? Walking dogs, what dogs do to stones, you know, RVs coming in and these small roads. So that's something we integrate into our plans a lot. One of the most fascinating projects we worked on was in Bodie, California, which is up in the Sierras outside of Bridgeport. And the whole town is a historic mining town. And it has the component, it has a historic district and then this historic cemetery up on the hill, and it's managed by the state parks. The whole town is a district, historic district, and they have something called arrested decay, which they just leave the buildings in a state of that looks like decay, but they support them in different ways. So they don't paint the buildings, they don't really do this restoration that you can see. There was a historic cemetery that really wasn't part of the district, and they wanted to see about doing more history of the cemetery and do a master plan for their cemetery. In that case, it was such high use, they get thousands and thousands of people, that the impact on the cemetery was, from the aerials, was just pretty dramatic. It was just walking over graves, and so we did a photo, we took historic photos and took pictures from the exact same places and compared them and see how many cemetery stones were lost, weren't there, enclosures weren't there. So they're slowly, through that process, they're slowly trying to restore a lot of the stones that were there at one time, and also the fences, if they have good documentation. But the site was just this web of just, there was no clear pathway, and so it was just a web of just erosion on the site, which wasn't good. So we worked on that one. I think they're using the plan and kind of doing a systematic closing off different areas of the cemetery so people won't impact it so much. Somebody in the 1920s and teens started buying up all the houses in Bodie, and then he donated in the 50s this whole town. So it was kind of different. He really wanted it to be a ghost town. And at that point, everything was in the buildings. I mean, you could go in the schoolhouse and it would be all the books, the globes, everything was there. And people started stealing things in the 60s and 70s because everything was open. So now they have them closed, but you can have tours. But the idea is to have it like a ghost town like it was back in the turn of the century. And Bodie really had its heyday only for about 20 years, and then it started going downhill. This was like in the 1880s or so, in the gold rush. So what they're trying to do now is kind of modernize this theory about arrested decay, because you still do the structural work, but it doesn't look like a new building. They still don't paint them. And I think it's just a way to express what Bodie was like at the turn of the century, basically. But they don't want the buildings to fall down. So they do a lot of internal kind of rehabilitation, things like that. And they do a lot of, it's so dry down there, the wood is pretty well preserved. I mean, we walked down, we were in the cemetery, and I could not believe the quality of the stone compared to here, because we have so much moisture. It was like they were carved yesterday, and that was pretty amazing. So, we didn't have to do much cleaning, guidelines to them. So, but I think they're changing a little bit that out. They don't like that arrested decay. They're trying to more change it in a Secretary of Interior standards, which specifies guidelines for preservation. They're trying to work that into rehabilitation, is the word they're using now, and restoration, which is the exact duplicate of what used to be there. So that's what they're doing now. Question being about kind of the future of preservation, maybe, and working with my family, which I actually have been doing. My niece, Adrienne Donovan Boyd, got her degree 20 years after I did. I taught her a lot about the basics, and she taught me new ways of doing things and kind of keeping up on technology more. And so she just one day said she was interested in the preservation program and wanted to go, and did it in 2 years and got out, and then we started working together. Preservation is pretty much, when you have your own business, any business, you work a lot, You have to have that drive, and you have to have the passion about it. And I still have the passion, especially for research. I can do research 24/7. I love that. I don't like writing, and that's always been a part that I just don't enjoy that much, but I like the research part. So that's why cemetery work is really nice. I don't have to do a lot of writing in that, so it's kind of freeing me up like that. I see it going in two ways, preservation. I think it's a little scary because of the development, depends on where you are. But that's always change, is always going to happen. It's happened in 1900, it happened in 1920, So I think the thing I've learned too over the years is that you've just got to really change with the times, and kind of, it's a balance, it's a compromise and balance, and so students are always wanting to be that preservationist, that's the only way that you're going to do it. You got to preserve that building, you got to do that. Well, there's they don't think about cost, or what that takes planning wise, so I think that's something that I've learned over more reality check, and especially doing our own projects. You really get a good sense of what that is for the property owner, like that. I feel good about it in the way that it's more mainstream, and architects now, and a lot of engineering firms, and a lot of the federal mandates are making people look at preservation. The regulatory aspect of it is bringing that preservation in, which is good. So we didn't have that before. And we need a little balance of that, because if you didn't have the regulations, it just wouldn't get done, usually. It would go back to the little house museums with people running it. So it's expanded. In the 30 years I've been in it, it's really expanded a lot, just from survey and inventory to all-encompassing. Preservation and modernism is the bungalows were, 30 years ago when I started working. So it's another transition, and I think it's a great movement. It tells about our society and what was happening in the 50s and 60s, and I love it because I grew up in that era, so I embrace it, and I like the designs. I think they're great. So now it's this post-war era, which is fascinating, what the housing was like and what the people were like, and that optimism, and so I think it's a great movement. I think creating that sense of place is really important. People that don't like preservation, I always ask them what they think about when they think about their community. It's always some building that's like their courthouse, or I just became a generalist because that's what I had to do. Right. And I had an interest, the photography and the research, but I didn't really plan that. It was just, I needed the job too. I hired my husband, Bruce Howard, in 1991 to help me with the survey work that we started, and so we've been working together ever since then, basically. We've done all sorts of projects together over the years, and from house restorations to surveys to photo jobs, and he just learns it as he goes, and real talented like that, and it's been fun. We've learned how to work together.